Hello, hello, hello. This is the Book of Numbers Explained. As we've been going through the Explained series chapter by chapter to explain books in the Bible within 20 to 30 minutes. We also do Bible studies on any particular chapters that take about an hour. Hit the like button, subscribe if you're new. Join along with this family. We do many things on this channel, and it's all for the glory of God. The fourth book of the Old Testament that teaches the identity of the people of God is the book of Numbers. God's provision for authority over his people and God's plan for their fulfillment as a nation. It answers the questions: who are the people of God? Who is in charge here? And what are we doing? See, this title, the book of Numbers, is based on the numbering of people. Numbers chapter 1 verse 19 and verse 45, Numbers chapter 2 verse 33, Numbers chapter 3 verse 42, Numbers chapter 4 verse 49, Numbers chapter 26 verse 4. In the Hebrew Bible, it uses the word Brimidar, which stands for in the wilderness, as the title. This is a helpful description giving the setting for much more that happens to God's people than taking census. In fact, most of the commentators throughout most of the Bibles you can find, they use it as a geographical outline to summarize the book. And the outline is simply stated as Numbers chapter 1 verse 1 through Numbers chapter 10 verse 10, what happened at Mount Sinai. Numbers chapter 10 verse 11 through Numbers chapter 20 verse 13, what happened in the wilderness. And Numbers chapter 20 verse 14 through Numbers chapter 36 verse 13, what happened from Kadesh to Moab. Now, it's really quite simple, the contents of this. It seems most productive to consider the contents of this book in light of three questions above. As we had stated, who are God's people? Who is in charge here? And what are we doing? See, in this way, the reader is able to see every aspect of life during the wilderness wanderings, as they continue to wander and wander and wander. See, under God's instruction, Israel conscripted an army. God's presence radiated both a sense of awe and well-being in the center of the camp. God's promise of a landed inheritance gave them a goal to strive for and an identity. And God was the ultimate authority and spoke both indirectly through his human representatives and directly through his miraculous power that you see throughout the Bible. But there's one thing: there was a rebellion that happens through all this. Numbers chapter 11 verse 1 through Numbers chapter 12 verse 16, Numbers chapter 14, Numbers chapter 16, 17, and 20, chapter 21 verse 4 through 9, and 25 1 through 18, as well as an account of Balaam the wizard in chapter 22 through chapter 24. See, this serves to show how God's plan and provision cannot be thwarted by any rival possible or any of their power. No one could overthrow God. Israel needed to stay on God's side to find success. Let's talk about a quick overview of the book of Numbers before we get into a few other things. The book of Numbers is about preparation. Everything in Numbers 1 verse 1 through Numbers 10:10 prepares the nation to leave Mount Sinai, where it had been for almost 11 months, as you see in Exodus 19 verse 1 through 2 and Numbers chapter 10 verse 11. But the Israelites refused to enter the promised land in God's timing, as you see in Numbers 10 verse 11 through Numbers 20 verse 21. So the rest of the book, from Numbers 20 verse 22, from Numbers 36:13, may be reviewed as another preparation to enter the land of Canaan. This second preparation was necessary because the first didn't work. Now let's talk about the preparations at Mount Sinai here. Mount Sinai, with its constant reminders of God's presence, was never intended to be the final destination for God's people. There comes a time to break camp and to head out into the world and to claim God's promises and to fulfill the calling. Some people still today stay within the camp and they don't hear God's calling to head out and to do what the promises of God are. The first major unit of Numbers 1:1 through Numbers 10:10 comprises instructions for breaking the camp and moving through the desert under God's direction. And Numbers chapter 9 is the literary climax of Numbers chapter 1 verse 1 through Numbers 10:10. In the first half of the chapter, the Israelites celebrate the Passover before their departure from the mountain. Likewise, they would again celebrate Passover before the Battle of Jericho and the conquest of the Promised Land that you see in Joshua chapter 5 verse 10 through 12. Now here, the final preparation for departure from Mount Sinai involved instructions for 2 silver trumpets that you see in Numbers 10, verse 1 through 10. Variations of the trumpet alarms would indicate how the camp of Israel would proceed in the march that they would go through verses 5 and 6. The trumpets were also used to prepare for warfare in verse 9 and on various occasions of worship, as you see in verse 10. With this final bit of instruction, the people were ready for their departure and to head into the next conquest of their lives. Now really, we're going to get into a bigger amount of talk here. Now we're going to talk about the disobedience in the desert. There's so much more to describe between this. See, the long period of the desert wanderings is described from Numbers chapter 10, verse 11 through Numbers 20, verse 21. The importance of Israel's actual departure from the mountain is underscored by the precise date in Numbers 10, verse 11, on the 20th day of the second month of the second year since their rescue from the Exodus in Egypt. See, the divine cloud rose over the tabernacle, and the people of Israel set out on their journey to the promised land in chapter 10, verse 11 and 12. Moses was overjoyed at the scene and prayed that God's enemies would be scattered before them as they marched in verse 35. But unfortunately, this was only a prelude to the failure. The bright optimism of chapter 10 is soon shattered by a stubborn rebellion in chapter 11. Now, chapters 11 and 12 relate the difficult journey from Mount Sinai to the desert of Paran. Only a few of the sites mentioned here can be positively identified, like Hazeroth, as you can see maps about Israel's desert wanderings, as we put it on the screen here. The Israelites had trouble all along the way. And Numbers 11 verse 1 sets the unfortunate tone for the next several chapters. Now, when the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, is what the Bible tells us. They had complained from the moment they left Egypt about the lack of food in the desert. So God had miraculously provided quail and bread that they called manna from heaven in Exodus 16, as we remember. But now their supply of quail had run out, and they were weary of the manna. Once again, God provided for them, but their rebellious attitude resulted in the desert fires and plagues in Numbers chapter 11, verse 1 and verse 33. There is something ironic about the Israelites complaining about their desert diet and longing for all types of different food that they had from Egypt. Had they forgotten that they were slaves in Egypt, is what a lot of people could be asking themselves by reading this. How did they so quickly forget how God had rescued them from severe pain and suffering? How could they rebuff his guidance? Their complaints were far more serious than merely whining about food. The Israelites had an inner attitude of rebellion that plays a dominant role in the book of Numbers. And really, it's a big lesson to us as well. Even if you're a Gentile, think about what God has saved you from and how we can still rebel with an inner attitude and just not like the things we see. Look, they were prone to reject God's provision and leadership for their lives. Even after his miracles, their deliverance from Egypt, and his provision for their needs along the way. And chapter 12 continues this theme by relating the opposition of Aaron and Miriam to the leadership of Moses, and therefore to God. Moses' own family was jealous of his unique position before the people as God's sole spokesman. This can happen in your life too. Whether it's family or friends, they may not like a position that God's put you at. See, God dramatically affirmed Moses as his chosen leader, though. But now the leadership, as well as the wider populace, was disagreeable and discontented. The whole nation seemed inclined to rebel, and that's all they kept doing. See, Israel's ultimate failure was in the refusal to enter the promised land when God offered it in chapters 13 and 14. Numbers 13 relates the famous story of the 12 Israelite spies, 2 of them who were Joshua and Caleb. When God commanded Moses to send spies into the promised land, he intended that this reconnaissance mission, you could say, to prepare Israel for the conquering of the land. Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites, as you see in Numbers 13 verse 2. God was already in the process of giving the land to his people, but the spies brought back mixed reports. In Numbers 13, verse 25 through 33, the Canaanites were well fortified in the land, and they had this huge stature that scared them, making the Israelite spies look and feel like grasshoppers, as it says in Numbers 13, verse 33. So overwhelming the task that a majority opinion of the spies was that it was impossible. But apparently Joshua and Caleb were the only ones that thought differently in Numbers 14, verse 6 through 8. When they heard the report, incredibly, the Israelites regretted ever leaving Egypt. If only we had died in the land of Egypt, is one of the things they say in Numbers 14:2. See, they promptly decided to replace Moses with a new leader who would take them back to Egypt, as you see in Numbers 14, verse 4. Numbers 15 through 20 is talking about the wanderings of the Israelites for nearly 40 years in the desert. They stayed near Kadesh in the desert of Paran in Numbers 13:26, as it tells us, though the desert of Zin is also mentioned in Numbers 20, verse 1. This is part of Israel's desert wanderings. But curiously, these chapters actually, my friends, tell us little about the events of those years. They do not relate the course of Israelites' travels or any particular timetable for the traveling, as the author did for the rest of the book. Instead, these chapters contain laws that the Israelites were to obey once they were in the land of milk and honey and Canaan, and few selected stories of failure and disobedience. See, the location of the laws on offerings to be observed in Canaan is curious in chapter 15. See, the movement from the previous chapter to these cultic and ritualistic laws seem abrupt. And most scholars, as you see through a lot of studying, have wondered why they are here instead of in Leviticus. But we should never question why God placed things inside Scripture and how he placed it in Scripture. But coming immediately after the revolt in Kadesh, these laws may be intended as a striking statement that God's purposes would continue with or without Moses' generation of the Israelites. They had refused to obey God's direction to enter and occupy the land. They were going to die in that desert. But God intended these laws for worship, and their children were to learn them in the anticipation of the future day when they would live in the land of Canaan, a day that would certainly come. See, the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers 16, verse 1, seriously threatened Israel's leadership, especially the priestly line of Aaron. But an earthquake killed the rebels, and fire consumed all their followers in Numbers 16, verse 31 through 43. In confirmation that Aaron's family was the legitimate priestly line ordained by God, Aaron successfully interceded on the behalf of the people in Numbers 16, verse 44 through 50. As further vindication of Aaron, God caused Aaron's rod to sprout and produce ripe almonds in a test to see who was really chosen by God in Numbers 17, one of the most miraculous stories in the book of Numbers, that God can show you his power, that he can grow anything. He can make even almonds start to sprout out of a rod that a person carried in their hands. Look at chapters 18 and 19. They contain more laws to protect the Israelites against uncleanliness. Of course, Leviticus speaks a lot of this too, but Numbers speaks it in a different way. The priests and the Levites were responsible for preventing divine judgment because any uncleanliness associated with the tabernacle in chapter 18. Chapter 19 is concerned specifically with ritual uncleanliness caused by contamination due to contact with the dead. Once again, these laws anticipated the life in Canaan, as Leviticus was just talking about their life in general. See, the author has again followed a report of rebellion and failure with one of the instructions for a future life in the promised land. God's plan will not be thwarted, even though people try to at all points and times. Look, Moses' sin at Kadesh is a reminder that no human leader, not even Moses himself, is exempt from the consequences of unbelief. In Numbers 20, verse 2 through 12, it speaks of this. See, he spoke to the people instead of the rock in Numbers 20, verse 10 through 11, and thus reflected a lack of faith in God's directive. The Old Testament knows no distinction between faith and obedience. Faith is the correct response to God's word of either promise or command. So Moses' actions were comparable to the rebellion of the people when they refused to enter the promised land on God's timing. Now his fate was like theirs. He would not be permitted to enter the land of Canaan in Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. Ultimately, to look back on chapters 15 through 20, the laws of the chapters 15 through 20 talks of these. Look to the future in the land and imply that the rebellion of a single generation cannot prevent God from fulfilling his promises to the patriarchs. And of course, it may have not been in the timeline that a lot of them wanted, but God still was going to fulfill these promises. See, the accounts of Korah's rebellion and Moses' sin at Kadesh indicate that the promises of God will be fulfilled in spite of the failure of Israel's leadership. Moses' generation was forced to mark time in the desert, but God was not going to stop there. He was faithful to his promises to Abraham, even when the Israelites were faithless to him. We're going to speak about Balaam real quick before we get to the next section. Balaam was a non-Israelite prophet whom Balak, the king of Moab, urged to curse the invading Israelites for a small fee. See, Balaam was one of the many prophets of the Eastern religion who worshipped all types of lowercase g gods of the land. Many of these false teachers had great power and influence throughout the land. When they pronounced a blessing or a curse, it was considered as a true prophecy. See, when Moses led the people across the wilderness, God commanded him not to attack Edom or Moab in Deuteronomy 2, verse 4 through 9. And Moses listened. He did not. But when Edom attacked, Israel turned away from him in Numbers chapter 20, verse 21. As the great nation journeyed north on the east side of the Jordan, King Balak of Moab faced the invasion of Israel. Balak sought to find him someone that could bring some strategy to stop Moses and the Israelites. He decided to use one of the prophets to curse Israel. Balaam was the chosen one he chose. Balak sent his messengers with a small fee to secure Balaam's services. And upon this, Balaam asked permission from God to curse Israel. And of course, God refused this permission and told him he would not curse Israel. But Balaam journeyed to confer further with Balak. On this journey, Balaam's donkey talked with him as he traveled a narrow trail in Numbers 22, verse 21 through 30. 2 Peter 2:16 also speaks of this. Here, Balaam clearly understood that the angel's drawn sword enforced his obedience to speak only God's message to Balak. Later, in 4 vivid messages, Balaam insisted that God would bless Israel instead of cursing them in Numbers 23 and Numbers 24. God used Balaam to preach truth. He even spoke of a future star and a scepter in Numbers 24:17, a prophecy that was ultimately fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Balaam's actions, Balak did not like them. Balak ended up doing some actions that brought God's anger upon Moab in Deuteronomy 23, verse 3 through 6. In a battle against the Midianites, Balaam died in Numbers 31, verse 8. And Joshua 13:22 speaks of this. Balaam could not curse Israel, but he taught the Moabites to bring the men of Israel into Baal worship. For this, God would punish Israel. What Balaam could not accomplish with a curse, he did so through the seductive means of teaching them the wrong and improper worship. Now, in the New Testament, Peter warned against false teachers and described their destruction. He referred to them as fallen angels and the watery destruction of the unbelievers in Noah's time and the fiery judgment on the lawlessness ones in Sodom and Gomorrah in Lot's day. Peter described his generation of false teachers as those with eyes full of adultery who never stopped sinning by seducing the unstable religions that they taught. He further said that they bore a curse as experts in greed. Peter wrote that they left the straight way and followed the way of Balaam in 2 Peter 2:15. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, the church at Pergamos was talking about the faithfulness under persecution, but also warned that some followed after Balaam in offering meat to idols. Now, the rest of the book of Numbers describes the preparations in the plains of Moab in chapters 20, verse 22 through Numbers 36, verse 13. The journey is an eventful journey to Moab, as you see in Numbers 20, verse 14, and through Numbers 21, verse 35. Moses and the Israelites faced a lot of opposition during this march to the Promised Land. The strategy was to avoid confrontation at all costs, and it shows us about their journeys through Numbers chapter 20, verse 17, and Numbers 21, verse 22. They were on a mission to another place, a better place that God had promised them. In addition to the armies of Edom and the Amorite armies of Moab and Bashan, the journey was hampered by more complaints of the Israelites. In Numbers 21, verse 4 through 9, this tells us of a plague of serpents because of their rebellion. When the people repented of their sin, God instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and mount it up on a high pole. Whenever one of the serpents had bit the Israelites, the dying person was instructed to look at the serpent on this pole and to live, in verse 9, repent from their ways. This, of course, taught them about the availability of salvation. And just like the ancient Israelites could be saved by looking at that bronze serpent lifted up in the desert, so may we be saved by looking in the faith of Jesus Christ lifted up on the cross. In John chapter 3, verse 14 through 15, it speaks of this. Now in Numbers 22 through 24, this presents the first of a series of events that happened to the Israelites while they were camped in the plains of Moab. Balak, the ruler of Moab, was rightly concerned about the Israelite nation camping in his backyard. He had demonstrated a surprising ability to subject an enemy that tried to stand in its way. He was ensuring that military success against Israel. And Balak enlisted a service of a professional magician, or they called him a wizard, to curse Israel. Of course, we talked before this about what Balaam did. And we're not going to go any further in that because we explained quite a bit of it. But then in the rest of the unit in Numbers 23 through 24, this contains 4 blessings that Balaam pronounced over the unexpected Israelite camp. Balaam articulated the exact opposite of what Balak had commissioned him to do, much to Balak's disappointment, but that talking donkey was not the most miraculous element of this episode. The Spirit of God came upon Balaam in Numbers 24, verse 2, and reversed the curses that had been planned. See, this is an amazing act of God. This is the greatest miracle of the passage and must have surprised even the seer in that time himself, not to mention the Moabite king. In doing so, God was fulfilling the promises of the covenant. Even while Israel laid passively spread out in the valley below, the Israelites encamped at Moab was a final stopping place before they crossed the Jordan River and entered the promised land under Joshua's leadership, of course, in the book of Joshua, which we will get into at some point. See, in 2 previous temporary camps, Mount Sinai and in Kadesh, the Israelites had jeopardized their covenant relationship with God through a apostate type of church like we're seeing in the end of days, an apostate type of church. You remember Aaron's golden calf at Mount Sinai in Exodus 32 and the rebellion at Kadesh in Numbers 11 through Numbers 14. And this threatened Israel's existence. Unfortunately, the Israelite behavior in the plains of Moab was no different. Now see, to finish out here, in Moab, the manifestation of the Canaanite Baal worshipping included sexual immorality under Balaam's influence in Numbers 31 verse 16 and Revelation 2:14. The Israelites were quick to intermarry with women of Moab and to worship their lowercase g gods in Numbers 25 verse 1 through 3. God's displeasure was evident in the plagues of Numbers 25 verse 9 and nearly destroyed the nation. Now Numbers 26 records another census taken to provide information necessary to divide up the promised land among various tribes. While Israel's sin and religious apostate mentality seemed to imperil the covenant plan for the future, God patiently and lovingly continued to insist that they would enter the land. In the rest of the book, Numbers 27 through 36, this recounts the final preparations for Israel before it leaves the plains of Moab and enters to the promised land. The mixture of law and historical narrative is to ensure that the covenant promises are soon to be fulfilled. Numbers 27 presents instructions for worship on special occasions in religious calendars once the Israelites are in their new homeland. Joshua was designated to replace Moses, and one who would lead them into the promised land, as you see in Numbers 27, verse 12 through 23. Now, Numbers 28 through 36 contain instructions for land allotments. There's not a lot of talk about this. It's about where they break up the land, and further wars with surrounding adversaries and laws to implement justice and worship in Canaan. Now, to end Numbers Explained, we're going to bring up a couple things before we end. The use of the book of Numbers in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul makes it clear that the sins of the Corinthians were not new in verses 1 through 13. As new Christians, the Corinthians must beware lest they fall back into their old ways that once enslaved them. Paul reminds his readers that the Israelites had also begun a new life of freedom in God's grace. He used events from Exodus and Numbers to illustrate that God's people can and sometimes do fail in their new relationship with God. Even after the Israelites experienced the Exodus and the bread raining from heaven and water in the desert, they rebelled against the very one who had delivered them. Paul used the Israelites' failure recorded in the book of Numbers to warn the Corinthians. The Israelites fell into sexual immorality in the desert. In verse 8 of 1 Corinthians 10, he speaks of this. This relates to Numbers 25, verse 1 through 9. Rebellious rejection of authority. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 9, this relates to Numbers 25, verse 5. And in their complaining in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10, this relates to Numbers 14:2. The result was a 40 years of desert wanderings and death. 1 Corinthians 10 reminds Christians that are in danger in the same failures. Paul asserts that the book of Numbers was written as a warning to them and to us in verse 6 and verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 10. He concludes in verse 12, so if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. Now, one other book that we're going to talk about before we close this is the book of Hebrews. The author of the letter of Hebrews, Paul, refers to the account of the spies and the nation's refusal to enter the promised land as a warning to Christian readers. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7 through Hebrews 4:13, it speaks of this. The letter warns Hebrew Christians to take care lest they have an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, like the Israelites of old. As you see that in Hebrews 3, verse 12. Their disobedience and their unbelief prevented the desert-weary Israelites from enjoying the rest and the peace of the promised land. But now the good news has come to Christians just as it did in ancient Israel in Hebrews 4, verse 2. And there remains for us a Sabbath rest in Hebrews 4, verse 9. Using the Israelite failure in the desert as a warning, Paul encourages his readers in Hebrews 4, verse 11, let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one may fall through such disobedience as theirs. May God bless you all. I hope you guys all enjoyed Numbers Explained, and we'll be working on Deuteronomy Explained next, the final of the first 5 books of the Pentateuch. May God bless you. Love you all. Keep your heads up, and remember that Christ goes before us into battle.